Welcome back to Flashpoint History's War of the Worlds. It was in the year 778 that an army under the command of Charlemagne, the soon-to-be great emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, was making its way back from Spain into France. While traversing the narrow pass through the small city of Roncesvalles in the northwestern portion of the Pyrenees, it was ambushed. The fighting was terrible. Those who organized and conducted the attack knew exactly how and when to hit their opponents. The French forces, who were commanded by a knight named Roland, were slaughtered. Despite his last stand, the rear guard of Charlemagne's line were killed nearly to a man, and the baggage train was captured before the attackers disappeared back into the hills under the cover of darkness. Charlemagne suffered one of his few, and some claim his only, defeats, and this battle was soon relegated to the status of a skirmish, or at the very best, a heroic last stand, which makes sense. I mean, why not? If you're an autocrat, you're going to make your mistakes look as rosy as possible. But this encounter was not forgotten, and instead transformed over the course of the next 300 years into something completely different. For anybody out there who's had a chance to watch the Lord of the Rings movie, there's a line in the introductory sequence which I think resonates in history. It takes place when the narrator is describing the aftermath of the titanic battle between good and evil. She says, "History became legend, legend became myth." We are now entering into a period of history where we're leading up to the Crusades, which, in my humble opinion, is one of the most fascinating time periods there ever was. A time where religious convictions led to the mass migrations of people and, of course, untold bloodshed. A time where the sources of information that we're dealing with are, well, let's call them not entirely trustworthy. One must be conscientious of the fact that they were written for the reason of galvanizing people for a purpose and glorifying the deeds of those who had furthered a cause. It's only when one looks back and has had a chance to compare sources and scrutinize them that it can be seen how much in certain situations history indeed becomes legend and legend becomes myth. As I mentioned in my intro to this series, I wanted to keep this podcast as secular and balanced as possible. But at the same time, I also wanted to give everyone listening in the idea that in order to understand the lessons of history, we have to have a somewhat skeptical mind and to some extent question the motives of our references. Now, I've gotten a lot of excellent feedback from the audience about this, and I wanted to thank everyone who took the time to write in, whether that was in the form of comments or email or reviews, by creating this bonus episode on the 11th century epic poem, The Song of Roland. This epic poem is a great example of the glorification of the developing fight that would soon encompass Europe and the Middle East in the form of religious crusades. But let's begin with what actually happened that day in the Pyrenees. Most of Spain, by the end of the 8th century, was under the control of Muslims who had invaded the peninsula in 711. By the year 756, an Umayyad prince, who had escaped the downfall of the Umayyad dynasty, escaped to Al-Andalus and established an emirate under his family's name. His name was Abd al-Rahman I, and he was very good at what he did. The borders of his emirate expanded and soon encompassed a broad swathe of southern Spain, including many of the major cities. Sevilla, Toledo, Cordoba, and many more came under his jurisdiction, but not all were happy with the idea of being under his control. Indeed, his continued success bred ever more increasing resentment and desperation. In the year 777, a deputation of Saracen princes, who were also of the Muslim faith, from the eastern cities of Zaragoza and Barcelona, came to the court of Charlemagne to request military aid against Rahman and his ever-expanding territory. Charlemagne, who was destined to be the Holy Roman Emperor, crowned by the Pope nonetheless, was at this point busy fighting the Saxons, who, many of them, were Christian. As he had delivered a near knockout blow to the Saxons, he felt that he had a free hand to take the Muslims up on their offer. And so he garrisoned his other fronts and then marched into Spain with nearly his entire army. He was essentially a mercenary. He divided his army into two parts. The first crossed the Pyrenees near Pamplona, and the other came across near the city of Gerona, which was on the approach to Barcelona. Barcelona, which was under Islamic control, was turned over to him, and Pamplona, which for all purposes was the capital of the Basque in the north, was quickly captured and then occupied. Charlemagne's two prongs joined together at the city of Zaragoza, which initially was promised to him to be a friendly city, but the Saracen prince who held it had a change of heart. Perhaps he realized that the Frankish commander with his ginormous army was not someone he wanted to have as a hired gun after all. The city gates were barred, the garrison was reinforced, and despite the ensuing siege, Zaragoza held its ground and stood firm. But this expedition was only going to get worse for our Frankish king. Charlemagne got word that a fresh new wave of Saxon hostility had erupted in France once again, and so he was compelled to break off his siege and make a hasty fighting retreat, let's call it what it is, and get out of Spain to deal with this new threat. Charlemagne and his army moved to the north near Pamplona. He withdrew his forces out of the town, but he feared that her fierce people would use the city as a base to invade France, and so the city was pillaged and her city walls were destroyed, a deed that the resilient Basque were not soon to forget. With time running short, he then turned to the east to cross the Pyrenees once again. It was near the city of Roncesvalles that the rear guard of his marching line came under attack by the Basque, who used the cover of the narrow but wooded valley to create an ambush. While most of his men made it, the last of his line was surrounded and killed, nearly to a man, including some of his most prominent nobles, like Eghard, his seneschal, Anselm, the Count of the Palace, and Roland, Lord of the Marches of Brittany. Then, to add insult to injury, his baggage train was raided and the Basque dispersed under the cover of darkness, sustaining only minor losses. A later 9th century chronicler documented that this occurred on August 15th in the year 778. Charlemagne had to tuck tail and get back into France. Many considered this to be his only defeat. In reviewing this poem, I decided to use the Dorothy Sayers translation. She's a really eloquent writer and gives some excellent insight. Quote, "After this, the tale of Rosenvaux appears to go underground for some 200 years. When it again comes to the surface, it has undergone a transformation. The magic of legend has obviously been at work, and the small historic event has swollen to a vast epic of heroic proportions and strong ideological significance. Charlemagne, who was 38 at the time of the expedition into Spain, has become a great hieratic figure, 200 years old, the sacred emperor, the champion of Christendom against the Saracens. The expedition itself has become a major episode in the great conflict between Cross and Crescent, and the marauding Basque have been changed and magnified into an enormous army of many thousand Saracens. The names of Eggehart and Anselm have disappeared from the rear guard. Roland remains, and he is now the emperor's nephew, the right hand of his body, the greatest warrior in the world." End quote. Before we begin the poem in earnest, there's a couple of points that we have to cover. Number one, in epic poetry, it's considered normal for men to cry and swoon and pass out from stressors. So when this happens, it's not from something like PTSD, but rather to emphasize the drama of the moment. Number two, and this is probably one of the most important things to recognize, is that it would seem that the poet had only a cursory understanding of Islam. Muslims are referred to as paynims, which means pagan, and you're going to hear this word over and over again. And in juxtaposition to Christianity, they have a quote-unquote infernal trinity where they worship Muhammad, who is referred to as Mahund, Turgmanat, who is a diabolical personage of unknown origin, and Apollyon, who is the Greek god Apollo. It's not even clear if the poet is familiar with the existence of the Quran. And along these same lines, a lot of places and names are just made up as part of the poet's fantasy. And finally, 3, many of the proper names have 2 forms. For example, Charlemagne is also Carlon, Ganelon is also Gawain, and Marsilion is Marsile. Okay, so with that all said, we're going to do a run-through of the poem, hitting some highlights, but obviously there's not enough time to do the whole thing. It is, after all, an epic poem. But I will say this, if the poem or the transition between fact and poetry, or perhaps even the themes, stir up the thought process, then get a copy, buy it, download it, watch it for free on YouTube, and go through it in its entirety. And just for the record, my hope is never to advocate the themes of conflict and tribalization that are so prevalent within its text, but rather to sharpen one's ability to pick out truth from bias. The Song of Roland. Carlin the King, our Emperor Charlemagne, full 7 years long, has been abroad in Spain. He's won the highlands as far as to the main. No castle more can stand before his face. City nor wall is left for him to break, save Saragossa in its high mountain place. Marsilion holds it, the king who hates God's name. Mahund he serves, and to Apollyon prays. He'll not escape the ruin that awaits. Wow. Have you ever seen a movie and know that there is a glaring inconsistency right in front of you? You know, kind of Zorro fighting ninja kind of thing. This is the first stanza, and it already reminds me of the movie Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. Everything in it is wrong. Charlemagne hasn't been in Spain for 7 years. He didn't conquer the peninsula, but was rather just an aggressive tourist. And Marsilion doesn't sound like an Arabic or a Persian or even a Syrian name. Plus, why are all the Muslims praying to a Greek god? But I guess it's the intro and it sets the stage. The scene then goes on to the city of Zaragoza, which is the capital of the Muslim empire, where in the main palace, the king, not to be confused with an emir, Marsilion, is debating what to do next. Now he's talking with his high command, and his wisest advisor, Blancandrin, another great Moorish name, says that he should bribe the Frankish emperor. And so a peace envoy is sent, laden down with all sorts of gifts to the enemy camp, which is portrayed, quote, "The Emperor Charles is glad and full of cheer. Cordova's taken, the outer walls are pierced. His catapults have cast the towers down sheer. Rich booty's gone to all his chevaliers, silver and gold and goodly battle gear. In all the city no paynim now appears, who is not slain or turned to Christian fear. The emperor sits in a great orchard near, having about him Roland and Olivier." End quote. So this is basically a tailgate party celebrating the fall of Cordova. Give me a break, in reality this never happened. And while they're having this party, the Muslim envoy shows up with the goods. And by the way, this is Blancandrin that's talking. Quote, "Thus speaks the king, Marsilion, great in rule. Much hath he studied the saving faith and true. Now of his wealth he would send you in sooth. Lions and bears, leashed greyhounds not a few, 700 camels, 1,000 falcons mewed, and gold and silver borne on 400 mules, a wagon train of 50 carts to boot, and store enough of golden Byzance good, wherewith to pay your soldiers as you should. Too long you've stayed in this land to our rue." End quote. They're basically like, take the money and just get out. Now, Charlemagne is amazed by the gift, but doesn't accept it and sends the peace envoy away. But later, like in the Arthurian legend, he assembles his knights together to figure out what to do. Perhaps he acted a little hastily. Some of his knights advocate making peace, whereas Roland has a completely different idea. Quote, he tells the king nevermore trust Marseille. 7 years long in land of Spain we've been. I've won for you both Noples and Combilles. I took Valterna and the land of Pine I seized, and Balagate and Seville and Tudela. This war you started, wage on and make no cease. To Zaragoza lead your host in the field. Spend all your life, if need be, in the siege. Revenge the men, this villain made to bleed. End quote. There is absolutely no gray zone with Roland. He's definitely Charlemagne's id in this entire narrative. His entire stance is to go in for the fight, brashly, recklessly if need be. As long as you spill Saracen blood, he's good with it. Of course, not everybody agrees. The Duke Naimun advocates a more conservative wisdom. Quote, the king Marseille is vanquished in the war. You've taken from him his castles and his forts. With catapults you've broken down his walls. You've burned his cities and his armies outfought. Now that he comes on your mercy to call, foul sin it were to vex him any more. Since he'll find sureties his good faith to support, we should make haste to cut this great war short. End quote. So kind of like in a kumbaya circle kind of fashion, each one of the knights gets up and promotes whatever they think is going to be the best policy. Some are pro-war, some are pro-peace. Eventually you get to Count Ganelon, who stands up and advocates a more balanced policy. And when Roland hears this, he gets up and starts laughing in the man's face. So both men begin to quarrel and verbally claw at one another. This sets the scene that there is going to be some serious bad blood between these two. But in the end, the Emperor decides to send Ganelon, who continues to nurse his growing hatred of Roland, to negotiate with the Muslim king Marsilian. Quote, under tall olives the county Gawain rides, and Panem envoys he's caught up in good time, and Blancandrin drops back with him behind. Now each to the other begins to speak with guile. Quote Blancandrin, the French are men of worth, yet to their lord they do a scurvy turn, these dukes and counts when they counsel such work, both him and others they harry to their hurt. Blancandrin, by the way, is talking about how he's not crazy about the idea that everybody in the French camp is just advocating war. There's none, quote Gawain, who merits such ill words, save only Roland, for whom 'twill be the worse. One day his pride will undo him for sure. Danger of death day by day he incurs. If one should slay him, some peace may be preserved. End quote. Like I said, there is nothing in the gray zone about this poem. The two men continue on the road, and Ganelon continues to paint a giant target on Roland's back by making him out to be the major deterrent to peace. Now here's what happens when they get to Zaragoza. Quote, Blancandrin came before Marsilian, and by the hand held County Ganleon. Saith to the king, save you, sir, by my hund, and by Apollyon, whose blessed faith we extol. To Charles we gave your message every jot, and both of his hands he lifted up aloft, and praised his God. Further he answered not. One of his nobles, you see, he sent along, a lord of France of most illustrious stock. From him you'll hear if peace is won or lost. And so Ganleon looks at the king and responds with, King Charlemagne the Great thus sends you word, you must receive the faith of Christ our Lord, and as your fief half Spain he will award. If you refuse to accept this accord, you shall be taken and fettered by main force. End quote. Ganelon's response is that you will either convert and become Christian and become one of us, or you will die horribly in chains and be dragged off to some far-off land. Shockingly, Marseille is angered with this response, and he reaches for his weapon, and Ganelon does the exact same thing before he repeats his demand. You have to hand it to him, the guy has nerves of steel. Quote, the Christian faith must of you be accepted, and one half Spain he will give you in tenure. The other half is for Roland, his nephew. A right proud partner you'll have there for co-tenant. If these conditions should by you be rejected, in Zaragoza he'll besiege and invest you, and by main force you shall be seized and fettered. Then to his city of Ix you will go directly." End quote. The next couple of stanzas are like a scene out of Breaking Bad. Everybody is posturing and pointing their weapons at each other. Marsial goes quote-unquote white with rage, and his own son demands to kill Ganleon on the spot. But then Marsial thinks to himself, maybe this guy is just putting me on. He composes himself, and he begins to try to figure out if Charlemagne still has the stamina to continue to fight. Quote, "The Paynim said, I marvel in my mind at Charlemagne, whose head is old and white. 200 years I know have passed him by. In lands so many he's conquered far and wide. Lance thrusts so many he's taken in his strife. Rich kings so many brought to a beggar's plight. When will he be weary of going forth to fight? Never, said Gawain, while Roland sees the light. 'Twas east and west his valor has no like. Oliver too, his friend, is a brave knight, and the 12 peers in whom the king delights. With 20,000 Frenchmen to vanward ride, Charles is secure, he fears no man alive." End quote. You know what, just as a side note, if being 200 years old is not bizarre enough, I get the medieval/biblical idea that if you are supernaturally old, then you must be supernaturally wise thing. But aside from that, if Charlemagne was indeed 200 years old at this point in history, he would be older than Islam had been around. Now, what was he doing with himself if he wasn't fighting the Saracen? Whatever, back to the plot. Ganlon comes up with a better plan, albeit a treacherous one, and just in case I'm helping anybody out there with their term paper, this is stanza 43. Quote, "Gawain, fair sir, then said the king directly, I have an army you will not find a better. 400,000 good knights, as I may reckon, can I give battle to Carlin and his Frenchmen. Gawain replies, Not you, and so I tell you, for you Paynims the losses would be deadly. Leave all this folly, come to your sober senses, send to the emperor so huge a heap of treasure that all the French will marvel at its splendor. For 20 sureties that you will likewise send him back to fair France, Charles will return contented, leaving behind a rear guard to protect him. With them I warrant will be Roland his nephew, Oliver too the valorous and gentle. Dead are these counts, if you will give me credit. Carlin will see his great pride fallen and ended. A most villainous plan. Gawain, fair sir, the King Marcelin cries, What must I do to bring Roland to die? I tell you that, Count Ganelon replies, At Sizer Gate the king will have arrived, leaving a rear guard to keep the pass behind. There'll be his nephew, Count Roland the great knight, Oliver too, on whom he most relies, with 20,000 good Frenchmen at their side. An 100,000 send of your Paynim kind, and these shall first engage the French in fight. Of the French force the loss will not be light. Yours will be slaughtered, and that I'll not disguise. The like assault you'll launch a second time, and first or last Roland will not get by, and you will have done a deed of arms full fine. You'll never again see war in all your life." End quote. This is where we cue the maniacal laughter. Now, I personally find it rather ironic that the only way to further the plot of this poem, which is about the greater conflict between Cross and Crescent, is for a Muslim and a Christian to cooperate on a master plan. Can you say loophole? Perhaps it's best if we just table that thought for the moment. In either case, Ganelon has to swear an oath on his sword, Murgly, which means death brand, that he's going to fulfill this mission. And after he does this, there's a lot of rejoicing, an exchange of gifts, there's a lot of kissing, literally. And then Marsilion, who just moments earlier was ready to kill him, now shows just how much he likes Ganelon, and he proceeds to recount the plan for anybody who wasn't paying attention earlier. Repetition to the point of ad nausea, by the way, is a big theme in this poem. Quote, Marsilion's hand on Gawain's shoulder lies. He says to him, You are both bold and wise. Now by that faith which seems good in your eyes, let not your heart turn back from our design. Treasure I'll give you, a great goodly pile, 10 mule loads gold, digged from Arabian mines. No year shall pass, but you shall have the like. Take now the keys of this great burg of mine. Offer King Charles all the riches outright. Make sure that Roland but in the rear guard rides, and if in pass or passage I him find, I'll give him battle right bitter to abide. I think, said Gawain, that I am wasting time. He mounts his horse and on his journey hies. End quote. Must kill Roland. That's what I like about this poem, its subtleties. Ganelon is really chomping at the bit to make this plan work, and so he returns to Charlemagne post-haste and tells him that he has brokered just the most fantastic deal. Now listen to how the poet sets up the 54th stanza, which is an aside to the audience. There should be no conflict as to who Ganelon is in this story. The villain, the betrayer. Quote, early that day the emperor leaves his bed. Martins and mass the king has now heard said. On the green grass he stood before his tent. Roland was with him, brave Oliver as well, Nyman the duke, and many another yet. Then perjured Gawain the traitor comes to them and starts to speak with cunning false pretense. End quote. So the two men shake and hug, and Ganelon recounts his venture. Quote, the valiant king Marsil this message sends. The caliph's absence he prays you'll not resent. Mine own eyes saw 400,000 men in hauberk armed, some having laced their helms, and girt with swords whose hilts were richly gemmed. Attend him forth to the seashore they went. The faith of Christ they'll keep not nor accept, and for this cause they from Marsilion fled. End quote. In Ganelon's own words, there are 400,000 Saracen warriors. This has got to be hyperbole that the poet is saying to justify the later defeat of the rear guard. He's not just giving us overwhelming odds. 400,000 is an insane number. It's more troops than what came on the beaches on D-Day. But his plan continues to unfold. Quote, now as regards the Paynim king himself, believe me, sire, before a month is sped, he'll follow you to France, to your own realm. There he'll receive the faith that you profess. There with joined hands to you his fealty pledge, and hold from you in the fight the Spanish realm. Then said the king, the name of God be blessed. Well have you done, I shall reward you well. Throughout the host 1,000 trumpets swell. The French strike camp, their goods on a stumper set. Home to fair France, behold them all addressed. End quote. And so Marsilion is not only going to surrender and give Charlemagne a huge tribute, but he's also going to convert. Well, eventually. So this is mission accomplished, and thus without any other follow-up questions, the French pack up and make their way home. The next morning, the march comes to the high passes of the mountains. But while the French are basically making their way out of Spain, the Saracens are gearing up for war. Quote, in fields all around the French set up their quarters. Through the wide valleys the Paynim host goes forward, all fully armed, accoutred in their corselets, their helms laced on, and their swords in their sword belt. Shields on their necks, and their lances well ordered. High on the mountains in a thicket they've halted. 400,000 their wait for their morning. God, it's grievous that the French have no warning. End quote. But let's pan back to the French for a second, who have just arrived at the base of the Pyrenees. Quote, clear dawn is showing, 1,000 trumpets are sounded for the hosting. The emperor rides, full lordly in his going. Barons, my lords, quoth Charlemagne, behold now these lofty passes, these narrow winding closely. Say, who shall have the rear guard now to hold them? Quote Ganelon, I name my nephew Roland. You have no baron who can beat him for boldness. End quote. The next couple of stanzas is all about Roland not being happy about being in the back, but Charlemagne manages to soothe him over by giving him his blessing in the form of a bow, and he finally acquiesces. Quote, to Roland then the king his uncle said, nephew fair sir, hear now and heed me well. Half of my army I'll leave you for this stead. Keep them with you and you'll be safe with them. The count said, "No, I never will consent. May God confound me if I shame my descent. 1,000 score I'll keep of valiant French. Safe through the passes go you with confidence. Never fear man, so long as I draw breath." Our brave knight takes manliness to an art form. His response is always, "I got this." But consider the final line of this stanza, "Never fear man so long as I draw breath." Excellent foreshadowing. Now, Roland won't be alone in the back. He's got the 12 peers, who are similar to the Knights of the Round Table. They all join him, along with his best friend, Oliver. The march from this point onward is very difficult, but finally, from the high vantage point of the mountains, the army can finally see their homeland. Quote, "Higher the hills, the valleys dark and deep, grisly the rocks and wondrous grim the steeps. The French passed through that day with pain and grief. The bruit of them was heard full 15 leagues. But when at length their father's land they see, their own lord's land, the land of Gascony, then they remember their honors and their fiefs, sweethearts and wives whom they are fain to greet. Not one of them is, for pity doth not weep. Charles most of all a boding sorrow feels, his nephews left the Spanish gates to keep, but very ruth he cannot choose but to weep." End quote. Now, just as the front end of Charlemagne's army is making its way out of the mountains, the back end comes under attack. And Marcelon's nephew, who's to be the mirror of Roland, comes up to the king and wants first blood. Quote, "Marcelin's nephew trips out before the throng, riding a mule which he whips with a wand. He tells his uncle with laughter on his tongue, 'Fair sir and king, I've served you well and long. Much have I suffered, much labor undergone, many fields fought and many battles won. First blow at Roland is the reward that I want. With my sharp sword I'll split him through the scant.'" End quote. In recognition of his nephew's valor, Marcelian gives him his blessing and his favor in the form of a glove that he gifts to him. These gifts are meant to symbolize the grace that's given from a high liege to a subordinate. Now, when everyone in the Saracen army sees this, a bunch of Marcelian's knights come forward to talk about the manner in which they are all going to kill Roland. Indeed, the next several stanzas are each of these knights boasting about how they are going to be the first person to kill Roland. My favorite is, quote, and mind you, I don't think this person actually has a name, but he's the Emir from Baluget. Quote, "From Baluget there cometh an Emir, his form is noble, his eyes are bold and clear. When on his horse he's mounted in career, he bears him bravely armed in his battle gear. And for his courage he's famous far and near. Were he but Christian, right knightly he'd appear. Before Marcel he cries for all to hear. To Rosenvaux saith he, my course I'll steer. And if I find Roland, then death shall be his weird. And Oliver and all the 12 peers. The French shall die, the death in shame and tears. King Charlemagne, the dotard, old and blear, will soon be sick of waging warfare here. Spain shall be ours in peace this many a year. The King Marcel pours thanks into his ears." End quote. I absolutely love this stanza. I mean, after all, there is nothing worse in the world than being called a dotard. So with the manly posturing aside, the battle begins, and Roland's response is his standard, "Bring it on." Quote, "Fair was the day, the sun shone clear and bright, no piece of harness but glittered in the light. 1,000 trumpets ring out for more delight. Great is the noise, it reaches the French lines. Quoth Oliver, I think, companion mine, we'll need this day with Saracens to fight. Roland replies, I hope to God you're right. At this point, Roland goes off on one of his ours is not to ask why, ours is but to do and die kind of moments. Here we must stand to serve our king's side. Men for their lords great hardship must abide. Fierce heat and cold endure in every clime. Lose for his sake, if need be, skin and hide. Look to it now, let each man stoutly smite. No shameful songs be sung for our despite. Paynims are wrong, Christians are in the right. End quote. The polarization of the opposing views becomes ever more distinct as the poem goes on. There's no middle ground. But instead, there's a line in the sand, and this is going to be a religious fight. The two men discuss their options, and Oliver, who is Roland's companion and right-hand man, rides out to scope out the enemy forces. And when he comes back, he's got some distressing news. Quote, "Quoteth Oliver, the Paynim strength I've seen. Never on earth has such a hosting been. 100,000 in van right under shield, their helms laced, their hauberks all agleam, their spears upright, their heads of shining steel. You'll have such a battle as never was fought on field. My lords of France, God give you strength at need. Save your stand fast, this field we cannot keep. The French all say, foul shame it were to flee. We're yours till death, no man of us will yield." End quote. So if you had 100,000 and perhaps many 100,000 more coming down on your position and you only had 20,000 men to defend it, it would make logical sense to find better odds. But again, this is epic poetry, and to make logical sense has never been the goal. The French hold their ground, but Oliver continues to try to talk some sense into Roland. He says, "Hey man, blow that magical horn Oliphant of yours to summon in reinforcements," which Roland immediately rejects on the premise that this would be unmanly. This is an awesome stanza, by the way. Quote, "Companion Roland, your Oliphant now sound. King Charles will hear and turn his armies around. He'll succor us all with his kingly power." Roland replies, "May never God allow that I should cast dishonor on my house, or on fair France bring any ill renown. Rather will I with Durendal strike out, with this good sword here on my baldric bound. From point to hilt you'll see the blood run down. Woe worth the Paynims that ever made this rout. I pledge my faith will smite them dead on the ground." End quote. And so the two of them begin to bicker back and forth. Oliver is always depicted as being the smart one, the voice of reason, whereas Roland is portrayed as being the fierce one, if not the crazy, I've snorted too many lines kind of reckless one. But it culminates with his statement, quote, "Sir, friend, and comrade, such words you shall not speak. When the king gave us the French to serve his need, these 20,000 he chose to do the deed, and well he knew not one would flinch or flee. Men must endure much hardship for their liege, and bear for him great cold and burning heat, suffer sharp wounds, and let their bodies bleed. Smite with your lance, and I with my good steel. My Durendal the emperor gave to me, and if I die, who gets it may agree that he who bore it, a right good knight was he." End quote. And so their fate is kind of sealed. They're outnumbered and the enemy is bearing down on them, and Roland refuses to call in reinforcements or give up his ground. So the Archbishop Turpin gives a blessing to all, absolving them of their sins and reinforcing the idea that if they die in this way, they die as martyrs to their faith. The killing is about to begin, and Oliver, again the smart one, has figured out that they have been betrayed by Ganelon. Quote, "Count Roland said to Oliver right so, Sir, my companion, too true the word you spoke, that all of us by Ganelon were sold. He's taken his wage of wealth and goods and gold. The emperor's vengeance, I think, will not be slow. Marsil the king has bargained for our bones, but he'll need the sword to fetch his price home." End quote. The bloodshed begins, and despite being massively outnumbered, the French hack and slay their way through the entire Muslim line, leaving mounds of bodies in their wake. But then the Moorish nobility take the fight. Aldaroth, who is Marcelon's nephew, rides in and is swiftly cut down. He's cut literally in two by Roland, who has not even broken a sweat. And then Marcelon's brother, Farcelon, steps up to the bat to take on Oliver. Quote, "A duke was there, his name was Falseron, brother was he to King Marsilon. Abram's land and Dathon did he own, under the sky was no worse villain known. Between the eyes his brow was broad of bone, a full half-foot it measured, I suppose. His nephew's death he bitterly bemoans. Forth of the press he gallops out alone, the Paynim war cry he utters as he goes, and on the French an evil taunt bestows. Fair France this day shall find their honor flown. Oliver's hurt him, great wrath within him grows. Into his horse he strikes his spurs of gold. Rightly barrenly he rides to smite the foe. He breaks the shield, he cleaves the hauberk close, clean through the breast drives lance, pennon both. A spear's length flings him dead from the saddle bow. Down looks he, and sees the infidel lie low." End quote. And now, much like a Game of Thrones episode, the battle becomes really gruesome. The poet takes his time to embellish the individual attacks and the individual deaths of all the main players, and I'll give you some examples. Quote, "And Gurnon strikes Malprimus of Brigdale. No penny piece the stubborn shield avails. The crystal boss he splinters all in twain, that half the buckler falls down upon the plain. Through to the flesh he cleaves the hauberk mail, through to the heart he drives the good spear straight. The paynim falls flat down with all his weight." Wait, here's another one for you. "And El Galir, the Gascon of Bordeaux, spurs his good steed, slacks reins, and lets him go. With Erskirmiz, Valturnan's lord, he's closed. Off from his neck the splintered buckler broke. The hauberk's ventail he shattered with the stroke. He splits his throat between the collar bones. A full spear's length dead from the saddle throws. And says to him, the devil take thy soul." End quote. And it goes on like this for multiple stanzas. Roland, Oliver, and the 12 peers continue the momentum. They blaze a path of carnage like out of a Rambo movie. Quote, "The county Roland throughout the field goes riding. With Durandal good sword he stabs and slices. The toll he takes of Saracens is frightful. Would you have seen him, dead man on dead man piling, seen the bright blood about his pathway lying? Bloody his hauberk and both arms with fighting. Oliver too doth never cease from striking, and the 12 peers are not with behindhand, and all the French are hammering and smiting. The paynims fall, some dead, others dying." End quote. So you kind of get the idea, but this is only scratching the surface of the carnage. Each stanza gets just a little bit more macabre in the ways in which the Saracens are dispatched. But as we're about to see, this is only the first wave. A sound of trumpets is heard from the second wave, but before the fight is renewed, Roland turns to the audience and reminds everybody that this has all happened because of Ganelon's treachery. And the French are invigorated and brace themselves for the recommencement of a hopefully frenzied massacre. Even the archbishop rides into battle because in this alternative reality, even the clergy have a militant streak. But with this new wave of attack, the French begin to take losses. In fact, they get smeared, and once again the poet goes into explicit detail on how everyone dies. And finally, Roland realizes that he might have made a mistake. Quote, "When County Roland sees all his brave men down, to Oliver his friend he cries aloud, 'For God's sakes, comrade, fair sir, what think you now? See what good knights here lie upon the ground. Well may we pity this fair sweet France of ours, thus left so barren of all her knighthood's flower.'" End quote. Oliver is naturally pissed. He verbally cuts into Roland for not sounding the alarm earlier, and Roland's response is something to the akin of, "You mad, bro?" Quote, "Quoteth Roland, why so angry with me, friend?" And he, meaning Oliver, responds with, "Companion, you got us in this mess. There is wise valor and there's recklessness. Prudence is worth more than foolhardiness. Through your overweening you've destroyed the French. Never shall we do service to Charles again. Had you but given some heed to what I said, my lord had come, the battle had gone well, and King Marsil had been captured or dead. Your prowess, Roland, is a curse on our heads." End quote. So with that, Roland finally gets it through his thick skull that maybe he should have sounded the alarm earlier, and he says, okay, I get it, I'll go ahead and sound the alarm now. Quote, "The county Roland with pain and anguish whines his Oliphant and blows with all his might. Blood from his mouth comes spurting scarlet bright. He's burst the veins of his temples outright. From hand and horn the call goes shrilling high. King Carlin hears it, who through the passes rides. Duke Nyman hears, and all the French beside. Quoth Charles, I hear the horn of Roland cry. He'd never sound it but in the thick of a fight." Now, Ganelon is riding right next to Charlemagne, and he tries to blow off the entire thing. "There is no battle," Count Ganelon replies. "You're growing old, your hair is sere and white. When you speak thus, you're talking like a child." End quote. So that's got to be the reason why Roland was so hesitant to use Oliphant. It is a magical horn, and if you blow it too hard, it will, well, it will kill you. Now, on the other side of the pass, despite Ganelon's attempt to disperse the issue, Charlemagne decides to ignore him and instead arrests him, and then he goes in for the fight. Quote, "The emperor rides right wrathfully on his way, and all the French in anger and dismay. There is not one but weeps for very rage. For Roland's sake they're grievously afraid. The king arrests Count Ganelon straight away. He's turned over to the cooks in his train. The master cook he calls Besgun by name. Guard me him well, as fits a man so base, for all my house this villain has betrayed." End quote. While Charlemagne is turning around and going back through the pass, Roland on the other end is surveying the carnage and evaluating all the dead French that surround him, and then he opts to go back into battle with his all-powerful magical sword Durandal. This stanza, by the way, is going to be foreshadowing. It's one of the building blocks of the soon-to-be developing code of chivalry that's going to be taking Europe by storm in the oncoming centuries. It's going to be the in vogue thing to do. Quote, "The county Roland returns into the field, and like a warrior his Durandal he wields. Faldron de Poix through the midriff he cleaves, with 24 besides of great esteem. Never on vengeance was any man so keen. Even as the deer before the deer-hound flees, so before Roland the Paynims now show their heels. Quoth the archbishop, well done indeed. Valor like this becomes a knight of breed, that bears his arms and sits a goodly steed, forward and fierce in battle, should he be." End quote. The remaining French rush into battle, but their losses are staggering. Even poor Oliver meets his match. He gets fatally stabbed, but he goes down with a fight. Quote, "Marganus comes riding a sorrel colt. He spurs him hard with rowels all of gold, and from behind deals Oliver a blow deep in his back. The burnished mail is broke. Oliver feels that he's hurt to death. He grabs his sword Hoyt Clare, the keen of edge, smites Marganus on his high golden helm, shearing away the flowers and the crystal gems. Down to the teeth, clean splits him through the head, shakes loose the blade, and flings him down and dead. Then saith he, Foul fall you, accursed Paynim wretch. Charles has had losses, so much I will confess, but never shall you back to the land you left, to dame or damsel return, to boast of yourself." End quote. I really like Oliver. This man knows that he's going down, and if he's going down, he might as well be talking smack the entire way. Roland finds Oliver in a bloody heap, slowly oozing out his life. The men have a moment. Roland swoons, and then they make their amends and confirm that they've always been BFFs before Oliver passes. Quote, "When Roland sees his friend and comrade die, and on the ground face down beholds him lie, with tender words he bids him thus goodbye. Sir, companion, woe worth your valiant might. Long years and days have we lived side by side. Never didst thou wrong me, nor suffer wrong of mine. Now thou art dead, I grieve to be alive." End quote. Roland is grievously wounded at this point, and he's slowly dying from the effects of the horn Oliphant. But on seeing his best friend die in front of him, this galvanizes him to fight on, and from sheer supernatural power, he manages to push the Muslims back. And with the ensuing moment of peace, he once again looks around and sees all of his dead comrades. He makes his peace with God, and then finds a nice place to lay down for the last time. Quote, "The county Roland lay down beneath a pine. To land of Spain he's turned him as he lies, and many things begins to call to mind. All the broad lands he conquered in his time, and fairest France, and the men of his line. And Charles his lord, who bred him from a child, he cannot help but weep for them and sigh. Yet of himself he's mindful betimes. He beats his breast, and on God's mercy cries, Father most true, in whom there is no lie, who diddeth from death Saint Lazarus make to rise, and bring out Daniel safe from the lion's might. Save thou my soul from danger and despite of all the sins I did in my life. His right hand glove he's tendered unto Christ, and from his hand Gabriel accepts the sign. Straightway his head upon his arm declines. With folded hands he makes an end and dies." End quote. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are more than halfway through the poem at this point. And kind of like with a Shakespearean play, you hit a climax with Roland's death, and the rest is kind of denouement. I'm going to leave the detailed interpretation behind. If there's enough interest in the subject, perhaps another bonus episode can be made down the line. But for anybody who found the poem interesting up until this point, the rest of the poem is waiting for anybody to read. And again, you can find it just about anywhere. You can even watch it for free on YouTube. The second half of this poem is all about Charlemagne's vengeance against the Moors. His forces cross back into Spain, where he drives Marcelin's army into the Ebro River, but the Saracens get reinforcements from, of all places, Babylon, who embark from Alexandria and arrive in Spain. The supreme leader, Balagant, brings his elite warriors into play. The ensuing fight nearly destroys both sides, and finally you have the great confrontation of emperors where Charlemagne barely defeats the worthy and imposing Balagant with the aid of the angel Gabriel. So there you have it, the Song of Roland. This epic poem in Roland became one of the national standards of France, but it also went far beyond her borders and captured the imaginations of countless generations down the line. There are, after all, statues of Roland from Spain all the way to Latvia. Roland's story, death, and his horn Oliphant are also probably where Tolkien got his inspiration for the Lord of the Rings trilogy, especially the death of Boromir, for those of you who are familiar with that reference. Now, my point with all of this was to compare the real history to what later poets actually came up with, but try to imagine yourself a person of Christian faith living in Europe and having only this poem as a reference. How would that change your worldview? Dorothy Sayers has some good points on this. Quote, "The war itself is at first presented to us as a struggle between Saracen Spain and Christian France, but for all that, chiefly between Spain and France. It's only when the flower of the French chivalry lies dead at Rosenvaux and Marcelian has fled, mortally wounded at Zaragoza, that there loom up behind the figures of the French champions and the Spanish king. Then appear the more august images of emperor and emir, west and east, Christ and Islam." So the grand outline of the poem defines itself. A private war set within a national war, and the national war again within the world war of cross and crescent. The small struggle at the center shakes the whole web. The evil that is done can never be undone. God is vindicated, Marcelian and Balagant slain, Saragossa taken, its inhabitants set to choose between death and baptism. But Roland is dead, and the peers are dead, and the war between belief and unbelief, there is no ending." End quote. So what can I tell you? On one end, you have a beautifully written poem that emphasizes the ideals of chivalry, a blueprint, if you will, of what Christian knights of the Middle Ages would aspire to, and it's also a window into the thought process of the time. But on the other end, it's also a prelude to one of the most destructive time periods in human history. That ends the bonus episode. As I've mentioned, if there's enough interest, I can always come back and cover the second half of this epic poem in detail. I'd also love to hear back from you about what your interpretation of the poem is. Now that said, join us in the next episode where we go back into the main narrative, to the continuing story of Al-Andalus, when we get into the life and times of Abd al-Rahman III and the golden age of the Umayyad dynasty in Spain. By the way, if you like the music, it's from Paul Avgernos, Round Sky Music, Purple Planet Music, and the files from YouTube itself. The links will all be in the description of the podcast below. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, I urge you to return the favor and hit that subscribe button to get automatic downloads in the future. They're always going to be free, so you got really nothing to lose. But I do urge you to spread word about the podcast. History is not a treasure of wisdom that one should keep to themselves. Please also take that extra few moments to rate and review on iTunes/Apple Podcasts. Honestly, it only takes a minute, and it makes the greatest difference to anybody who has poured hours into making and producing a podcast. It truly means the world to a podcaster. If you liked what you're listening to, also consider contributing to Flashpoint History on Patreon. The link will be in the description of the podcast below, and as always, all funds go directly back into the show. By the way, you can also send me feedback and let me know how this new series is working out for you, or if you have some good insights, the email is flashpointhistory@gmail.com. You can also follow along with Flashpoint History on all the usual sites like Facebook and Twitter. So until the next episode, thanks again for listening.